near Washington, D.C., with a father, I read somewhere, having a mysterious government job in Washington. He studied journalism, and in his lecture he said that the task of journalism is to separate the truth from lies, or to separate lies from truth. I read in one of the interviews I got from his publisher in Holland that he was impressed by the new journalism of Tom Wolfe, and especially by the writings of Hunter Thompson. Why was he impressed by that? And he said, because of the treatment of language. Now my first question to Bob is, why the interest in language? Because Thompson, especially he, was a very political journalist.
Who was especially political?
Mr. Hunter Thompson.
Thompson,
yeah.
Was a political journalist. He was a political parodist. He was never interested in facts. He accused LBJ of taking LSD. Hubert Humphrey during the 1968 Democratic Convention. He accused Hubert Humphrey of taking LSD. I mean, he let his fantasy run into bizarre places. And that itself created a truth, but it wasn't the truth that you go to journalism for, it's the truth you go to literature for. It was a higher truth than what the truth of facts can provide. He completely dismissed facts and said, and looked at it as an artist looks at it.
But you were more interested in the how of the writing than in the what of the writing then?
Because for the very basic reason, the writing was exciting.
How?
The language. I was a young writer, and if you're a young writer and you're not drunk with language, if you're not word drunk, there's a problem. Why are you interested in books then? What are you looking for? You have to be delighted with the author performing some magical act. At least it seems magical when it delights you so much, and when it sucks out your own brain, your own consciousness, and inserts an entirely new consciousness in your head. I mean, that was the delight. That's what keeps you reading as a child. After lights out, after your parents say, go to bed now, and you get the flashlight under the covers and read.
Yeah, you have to do that.
It's language. First, as a small child, you read because the story is so seducing. And then the more sophisticated of a reader you become, you read because the language is so delicious. And at that point, then you become, you're a literary reader, and you don't have much patience except for as an escape for genre literature, for the Stephen Kings, for the spy thrillers. They're fun to read, but it's never a place you go for the more refined pleasures of language, of metaphor, of those are good enough reasons to go.
In Holland, some writers are insulted, or think they are insulted, if people call them journalists.
Yes, there are writers, my peers, who will think that they're insulting me by saying, "Oh, well, you do journalism."
But
because
you're not, of
you're
course.
not. No,
insulted.
Of course not. Of
But
course not, because they're pretentious asses.
Yeah, that's what I like to hear. But still, is there not a difficult relationship between journalism and literature? Writing articles for newspapers with a deadline, a deadly deadline maybe, and writing literature which takes time. Isn't it not water and fire sometimes?
Oh, I don't think it's that dramatic, no. I think it's just changing your glasses from sunglasses to normal glasses. I don't think it's so different. In terms of the sheer effort involved in doing it, in terms of the techniques that you need, I mean, one body of language or information comes entirely from make-believe. Of course, it's influenced by events you witness, by people that you know, by looking at you and imagining, well, I don't know you and we've never met, but if I married you, what would our life be like? And just start fooling around with that, making judgments, very reckless judgments, until you created an imaginary life. It's a child's life, a very formalized child's life. And journalism is an adult's life, but nevertheless, it's still working with language, trying to get the language to do different tasks, but working with language all seems the same.
Well, that's very clear.
Is it?
Yeah, for me it is.
Good.
If it's for the audience, that's another question. I can kind of speak for them. In my introduction, I told something very briefly about your wanderings in the 70s. What I didn't tell was that you joined the Peace Corps.
Corpse is a body.
Yes,
a dead.
I know. But don't you like my pun?
Yeah.
And you ended up in the Caribbean, in St. Vincent, I think. That was a very idyllic episode, but it ended in disaster because...
Yeah,
some nasty things happened. But what I wanted to know, is that the time you started to write seriously? Literature I'm talking about? Or
to tell you the truth, it sounds too dramatic, but yes. Something very dramatic happened to me. Somebody almost killed me in an attack. And frankly, yeah, that is the time I said, life, these are trite thoughts, but very important thoughts. When you have a brush with death, you reevaluate your life. And if you've been fooling around, you say it's time to get serious. Or if you've been serious, you say it's time to fool around.
One of the serious things in your stories is the way, I have to choose my words carefully, the way you write about women, or to say it more accurately, the way you identify with women brutalized by men. Is that a reaction to your experience in the Caribbean, or was it already in you? This attitude, I mean.
I would guess that it's already in me, because, as horrible as it sounds, I hardly know a woman who hasn't been raped, frankly. And it's always been quite clear to me, at least in my life, that the women that I cared for had, at one stage in their life, whether in their family or as they entered society and the university, or as they graduated from the university and entered the business world, that they had a different set of experiences than I did. And they all had some sexual horror that they had to face and overcome. And as I tell you that most of the women I knew had been raped, and I would guess that out of any assembly of women, a lot of them have had traumatic experiences, sexual experiences. That the women that I knew, I admired them so much because they fought every step of the way to gain strength, to gain inner strength, and to gain strength in the world. And I don't know if this is a battle that will ever be won, or if a battle between races will ever be won, but you see individuals trying to overcome the limitations that they've inherited, cultural limitations, and you can't help but think that they are the heroes of your life. They're the real triumphs.
A lot of women are very strong in your stories, or wealthy, by the way, at least one.
Well, one isn't a lot.
Well, you didn't. I will not be nasty. In one story, and this is a little bit humoristic. A man tries to trade a woman for a monkey.
Yes.
Is that realistic? I mean, considering the Caribbean and this kind of stuff.
Let's ask women.
This is a question about realism in your work.
There's some realism in my work. There's also some exaggeration in my work. But let's ask women. Can you conceive of a situation where a white man and a black man would get together and they would barter over a woman? Let's say the black man has power over this black woman. He more or less controls her destiny. And the white man has this dreamy sexual lust attraction for her. And so the white man and the black man sit down and they try. The white guy says, I really like Melandra. Is there some way you can arrange something for me? And the black man says, well, you really have something that I want. Maybe we can strike a deal. Does that sound outlandish? No. She says no. So, there.
Good. Yeah. Well, this was a question about realism.
Yeah, well, so it's real.
Yeah. But there is another component in your work, and I'll just quote one sentence.
Okay. About realism.
No. The world is vulnerable to mystery.
Yeah.
I like that sentence.
Too. Did I write that?
Yes.
Oh, great. That's great.
You can use the word voodoo or hoodoo or magic or whatever, but it's in your work and you deal with it at the same level as real events.
Yeah. Do you know the American writer William Kennedy?
Yes.
Won the Pulitzer Prize for a novel called Ironweed. He said that realism simply isn't enough to explain the human experience. That there's a spiritual side to human nature that will never be rational and will never fit into anybody's formula of what can be verified. And from a recognition like that, if you agree that that's true, then the world is a marvelous place. If you know what the Spanish call the Latin Americans call their literature, it's lo real. Let me pronounce it better. Lo real maravilloso. And the translation would be the itness or the experience that is marvelous and real. In English, we misinterpret that, mistranslate that, and call it magical realism.
Like Marquez writes.
Yeah. But he writes lo real maravilloso, the itness that's real and marvelous. And if you read the chronicles of the conquistadors, of Christopher Columbus, of the early explorers of America, they were seeing sights to them that were no different than seeing angels in the sky and miracles open up from the earth. And I don't think they were making it up, what they saw. They saw marvelous things that defied imagination. And I think that everybody has the opportunity to see marvelous things in their life or have something happen in their life that could never be explained rationally. And if most people say that they don't have experiences like that in their life, I say, okay, I believe you, but I don't know what to think, because most people I know and talk to, there's always something in their lives that they can't explain, an event that seems magical to them.
In one of your Bowen stories, that's my description.
Yeah.
And Bowen is an American, slightly out of place in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
There is a guy hunting for a gigantic sea turtle, and he says that a dream might be more important than what you see or what you don't see.
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
It might be more important, yeah.
There is a world within the world.
I don't know if it's true, but sometimes it seems that it's true.
Mm.
That particular story, I could tell you this. There are two black Caribbean, West Indian fishermen in a boat, and there's a white fellow with them. And one of the black captain of the boat announces that he had a dream the night before. And if you know, in black societies, like in Harlem in the United States, or in the South where I live, or in the West Indies, they have a dream lottery. You go to sleep, you dream of a white horse and a naked woman, and you wake up in the morning and there's a dream book where you can go and look up white horse and naked woman and get a number that corresponds with that image in the dream. And then you go bet on the lottery, according to that dream.
That's different from Freud, huh?
Yeah. So, it wasn't unusual for this, actually this experience happened to me, so I'll say me. It wasn't unusual for me to be hearing from this black fisherman in the third world that he had a dream and it meant something. But so his mate teased him. He said, "Oh, so what are the numbers of your dream?" And he said, "My dream don't have numbers. They don't correspond to anything." And so the mate said, "Well, what was your dream?" And he told the dream, and it was a very obscene dream. It was a homosexual dream, a dream of dominance. He had homosexually dominated another man. Isn't that a polite way to say it?
Oh,
yeah.
You can say anything in this place.
Well, I'm afraid to say absolutely anything. But so that was the dream, and he interpreted it. It meant that he was going to. There's a play on the word. Well, if I can say anything, I'll say it. There's a play on the word fuck. So the fuck as a sexual act and fuck as a competitive act, like walking away from an argument saying that I fucked the guy. I hope I'm not offending anybody. Maybe I am. I don't know. You've got whores on your streets in Amsterdam. How could I be offending you? You're very liberal. You're very liberal without being decadent. If you think you're decadent, maybe that's okay. But really, I tell you, you're not decadent compared to Virginia, right? American cities that are liberal but decadent.
Yeah.
But anyways, all I'm saying is, he dreamed that he dreamed that he had fucked a man, and now he said that this meant he was going to shoot a huge male hawksbill turtle, and in the process, he was going to fuck a man doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what happened 6 hours later. And it just didn't happen on the literal level, but it happened on the wordplay level, on the metaphorical level. He ended up in a situation where the turtle was in contention, this huge, legendarily big turtle. He not only got the turtle, but he more or less stole it from another man who also claimed a right to it at the same time, because they both arrived at the turtle at the same time. Now, what am I to think? My God, what am I to think? When 6 hours before a very complicated event, it's predicted on a literal level and on a metaphorical level. So if I stayed at home, I wouldn't have an experience like that, and I would be more sure about the realism of the world, I guess.
Mm-hmm. But this is a problem in literature and not in journalism.
I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what you mean.
I mean, the mystery that you cannot catch in words, in meanings, in understandable meanings, that's not the issue for journalism.
Journalists don't like mysteries. No.
Mm-hmm. You have to solve them.
Well, they might arrive at a dead end. They're dead ends. And they might arrive there graciously, but or they might ignore it and drive around it. I don't know how a journalist would report what I've just reported. Accept at face value and leave it for a reader to decide. Because if you report the facts still look like fiction.
Depends on the way you write, I think.
Yeah, but when you have something that's inexplicable, journalism can do that. It can handle that.
Well, let's talk about the literature of political experience. You have made a statement, quite a statement, I think, about American fiction, and you said that American writers suffer from a peculiar insularity, and that they have a dominant inwardness, and that you want a rehabilitation of the political literature. And I think you don't mean social realism or pamphletism,
No.
of course not. But I think that you only told one side of the story of American literature.
Yeah, I agree.
I happened to read and liked the novels of, I have to name a few writers, Thomas Pynchon,
Yes.
William Geddes, Don DeLillo,
Yes.
John Calvin Batchelor, who wrote a beautiful novel on the Civil War, American Falls, T.C. Boyle, William T. Volman, Norman Mailer, James Purdy, John Edgar Whiteman, Ishmael Reed. I can go on and on and on and on and on.
Absolutely. But you have
They
to
are
take,
very political.
You have to take Mailer out of there simply because he's not. His important work was long ago. But I agree with the rest of the list.
And I
I
can
don't
go on and
mind
on.
taking shots at the big guys.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, you could go on and on. The thing is, in the 1980s, which is really the period I'm talking about, which was when America had to redefine itself, you see the results of that. They're very hard. It's very hard to know how to feel about the results, because what you have seen is an America redefine itself and reemerge into the world. And what's the first thing that happens? Kabam! A huge war. It's not especially a good thing, but nevertheless, it's there. Or maybe it is a good thing. I can't even begin to say what it is, and maybe we'll know shortly. But in that time, American literature had to disengage from the post-Vietnam traumatic stress. Just like the veterans had to disengage from it, the culture had to disengage from it. As it disengaged, it was very easy for one thing to come into the ascendancy, which is how I described it, that a certain literature ascended, and another literature, in the very highest intellectual strata, another literature was ignored. But it was always there, and it was always doing good work and important work. But was it on the front page? No.
Listen, Don DeLillo with White Noise, but especially his Kennedy novel, what's the
Libra.
title? Libra,
Yeah.
was on the front page and has been sold. It's not a minor novel. It's not a novel in a dark corner of American literature.
No, absolutely not. But this is already while the transition is taking place. This is Libra especially. And White Noise is more subtle. White Noise is the type of political literature that I most admire.
Yeah.
Although, again, that never left home. But that's fine. It doesn't have to leave home. It was a very political novel because it made value judgments about American life.
It has been translated into Dutch, by the way.
Yeah, it's a great novel. Nevertheless, if you only pay attention to the system, to the noise machine, you only see one thing. You see the trend. You see that for very clear reasons, because the system is geared to make money, and it makes its money it's been making its money throughout the 1980s off the trends and off minimalism and off the inwardness, because it's been looking at a generation. It hasn't been looking at the full spectrum of American literature. It's been focused on a generation. Who is describing us today? Well, there are some people who think Don DeLillo is describing us today, and I think so. But from the literary machine, the noise machine, the publicity, and all the bright lights, I'm not going to go on.
Small cities.
Yeah. You would think that Americans are not paying attention to these issues that I raised. But they are. But, Don DeLillo is still a writer who's he's critically accepted, but he's not a popular American writer. There are very mixed feelings about him. Critically, I get a lot of acceptance in America, but there are very mixed feelings about, in the popular realm, people like my entertaining stories, and I feel a little burdened by the ones that are more political.
So if you talk about the rehabilitation of the political novel, political literature, you also mean that they have these novels have to be a bit more acceptable to the large public?
No, the large public just has to accept them more.
The other way around, yeah.
Yeah, and they have to do that, I think, for their own benefit. Although that's a dangerous thing to say. Because nobody has to do anything for their own benefit in America if they don't want to.
Yeah, that's true. Literature, nobody asks for literature, that's true.
Yeah.
But
as long as their sons are dying in foreign countries, they might as well go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, that's reminds me. You didn't want to be an American in the 70s.
No.
How about it now?
I'm quite happy being an American. Yet I don't think I'm starry-eyed about what America is. And yet, when I left America in 1973, I left America feeling the way a lot of Americans who were my age felt at the time, that this was the worst country on the face of the earth, and it would end up destroying the world if something didn't change. I went to some countries that were, in truth, much worse off, and where there never seemed to be a light at the end of the tunnel, and where decent people worked, slaved from sun up to sundown, and still dressed in rags, and still didn't have anything to show for their efforts, and neither would their children, and neither would their children's children. With that perspective, I could go back to America at least not being a spoiled brat anymore. I like America. I understand that America isn't perfect. I understand that it's far from perfect. But I also understand, for the first time, that Americans are decent people. And see, I could never think that when I was younger. I didn't think their intentions were good. And now I fully believe their intentions are good. Good intentions won't save them, won't save America. But it's a step in the right direction. Did you want to ask something?
Yeah. Is it possible to ask now questions?
Sure.
Okay, you may interrupt even.
Yes. May I start? I'm sorry. I would like to know, what made you go into the Peace Corps? Can you tell me?
Into the Peace Corps? Well, there are two different answers. One is one is just very pragmatic. I had a wanderlust and no money, and it was a ticket out of town. And that's probably the best way to go into any altruistic venture where you think you're going to help somebody. The second reason was because I grew up in the age of John F. Kennedy. I was, 10 years old, or I was in the 4th year of school, grade school, when he was assassinated. But still, I don't know if it was the same for everybody, but who was that young, but certainly I recognize it in enough people. His idealism influenced, in that very vulnerable age when everything's sticking to your experience and intelligence, his ideals stuck. And one of his ideals was that he recognized America was a wealthy country and had a lot of abilities that it could perhaps export to people in need and that help them out. Now, to tell you the truth, I had already lived in the Caribbean for a year before I went back as a Peace Corps volunteer. And by the way, most European countries have similar organizations. So my friends down there would have been British Peace Corps. They're not called the Peace Corps in the other countries, but British, Canadian, French, Italian volunteers. But I had already knew the third world a little bit, so I wasn't coming in as a virgin. And I knew that I would be very lucky if I could actually do something to help change a little piece of the life down there.
Thank you.
Okay.
Are there other questions, please?
Yeah.
Such stereotypes in that you started as radical in the 60s and ended up...
Here we go.
Bourgeois.
Why do
No, you're absolutely correct. I don't know how to answer it. Certainly,
You are a writer, by the way.
yeah, it's
Not a nurse.
It's a thought in my head to act, to go and help, to physically and help. It's a hard question to answer because I can't give you a right answer, an answer that you'll say, "Oh yeah, he's right, he's good, that's right, I agree with him."
But
I wasn't so much a radical that I was getting arrested in the late '60s, early '70s, but I was also very young. And I knew the war was wrong, but I didn't understand much about the complexity of things. That's not to say that now I understand that the war was right. That's not it at all. But I have to tell you that now I don't know yet about this new war. I don't know if I'm ready to protest it. I see the protesters who are protesting this war still protesting the Vietnam War. I don't see them protesting the Gulf War because they got the wrong issues. If they got the right issues, I'd be out there protesting with them. And the right issues are justice for the Palestinians. The price of peace is justice, and they weren't protesting that. They were saying, stop the war, no blood for oil. Oil was really not the most important issue in all this.
That's definitely true. But what annoys me in this question is the negation of you being a writer. How do you react to political turmoil, chaos, wars as a writer? Your lecture was on that, I suppose.
Yeah, he's more
That's the main
polite
question.
than me, because I want to try and answer you on your own terms, but on my terms, I could do the most. If I chose to, I could do the most good as a writer, not as. Maybe that's not true.
More stereotype of people of your age that are radical,
Yeah.
of more conservative.
Yeah, I know, but I don't know what the answer to that is. Is that life?
Maybe your age.
Well, that's what I mean by life. Did I just grow older and more conservative? I don't know, because most of my friends who I started out with, now they all have very middle-class jobs, and they're all very bourgeois. Not that I think bourgeois is so bad, but that's how they are. And they look at me and say, "Why don't I grow up?"
Mm-hmm.
So I get it from them, I get it from you, I get it from my parents. You can't do right.
Writing is a very hard job. I have a last question. You have a question.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm criticizing your fellow writers. I'm still wondering, because if I'm thinking of American literature, I think of involved people, I think of James Baldwin, who was writing about his society.
Sure.
So,
No, different generation though, because I'm really just
he was before you.
yeah.
It
Yeah.
was before.
You're absolutely right. And I'm addressing my generation. What's going on in my generation? And really, the whole list of writers you named there, the only one who's my generation is Tom Boyle.
No.
Yeah.
William T. Volman is even 31.
Who?
William T. Volman, published in Penguin. Well,
You can't
we
know
talk about it
everybody.
later.
Feminist writers who are beforehand in America who are inspiring us always on the front line.
Yeah.
And maybe you are not interested in them, but there are also writers like Lillian Rubin, who was a non-fiction writer, but they sold more of her books here
Yeah.
in the complete United States.
Yeah.
And that was really political involvement.
Yeah.
The subjects,
Well,
Pardon me?
the subjects say choose like the first, I don't know the English title.
Yeah.
It was about the workers' class people.
Yeah.
And it's really a political argument.
Yeah. I think the
And feminist issue too, and the homosexual
Right.
issue too.
Right. Now, there's terrific feminist literature and there's terrific gay literature, but there's also feminist tracts that try to pass themselves off as literature, because first it's mostly they tend to see themselves as political activists rather than artists. And sometimes that gets in the way of their art. But I'm all for what the feminist artists, feminist writers, gay writers are doing. And I don't have much trouble with the gay writers, or they don't have much trouble with me, but the feminist writers usually don't like me. They think that I have got too many hormones.
One chromosome.
And
less.
it's a shame because I'm their ally, to tell you the truth, but they're not especially warm toward me.
Hmm. I have a last question, and it's about your novel in progress. And it might be very hard to talk about a thing that is in progress,
Yeah.
but still, it's called Swimming in the Volcano, and the Bowen character, who is already featuring in some of your stories,
Yeah.
is the main character,
Yeah.
I suppose. In one of the interviews I read, I think it was the Memphis Chronicle somewhere, you said that in a way this novel is a model for what America does outside of our own country, and that was before
Yeah.
the war.
Yeah. I think of it as a model because the main narrative theme in it is, and the main philosophical theme in it is that a young Roman centurion, that's how I think of myself sometimes. When you go out, I'm a white middle-class male coming out of America into a third world village, and the children run up to touch you, and it seems like you're a god sometimes, and I guess because the way America acts, it seems apparent to me that America sometimes thinks it's a god, and they go out thinking that they're going to solve these little problems in these little places around the world. And I used to think that they were bad intentioned for doing that. Now I think they're actually good intentioned. But what happens is they want to go and solve the problem, and instead they become part of the problem. And so that's the theme of the book.
And it will be published in the fall.
And no, it'll be finished in the fall.
Well, I wish you good luck with it.
Thanks. I wish you good luck with yours too. It's been 6 years.
I will thank you for listening to us and for your own questions.
Thanks very much. I'm very grateful that you stayed and made me feel welcome.
And thank you, John Adams Institute, for your hospitality. Thank you.
Now to you all, also thank you. I think it's great you all came again. Thank you very much, Mr. Shacochis.
Thank you.
I think you did great.
Thanks.
Prepared well, had a great talk.
Thank you.
I hope you will come back. Thank you also. I hope you will all be here with Bruce Duffy. We will come
Without thinking twice, or making a boat trip around the world without being a sailor. These moods, these dark moods and obscure desires, are at the core of the stories collected in Easy in the Islands, just translated into Dutch. However, there seems to be a shift, not only geographically to North America, but also concerning his literary preoccupations in his second volume of stories called The Next New World, which has been published a few years ago. But we are still in the neighborhood of the sea. History, often combined with mystery, this is a coincidence of sounds, has crept into the tales, whether they are tall or not. By history I mean the right to remember and the right to rewrite the past. It is the American Civil War in, for instance, When Pelham Fell, a story in which an old man revisits the battlefields of Virginia looking for the bones of a few Confederate soldiers. It is World War II, very unexpectedly and out of the blue of the ocean, as it were, in the story of an old man and the sea. A man with a nasty, or should I say a Nazi past. And it might be, in The Next New World, a Shakespearean world in yet another dreamlike narrative. One of the stories in his second volume, Celebration of the New World is impressive in its display of a subtle emotional network between two old men at a family reunion on the 4th of July, that is to say, Independence Day. One man has Alzheimer's disease, and the other suffers agreeably from an addiction almost as radical, namely a political obsession for Trotsky and revolution. There is politics in the second volume, but not in a direct way, happily. I will give you another example of Shacochis' metaphoric language from his Civil War story Where Pelham Fell. It's my favorite story. I quote, "History could be scratched by the imagination and made to bleed on a few hundred acres of greensward and farmland fouled magnificently by violence." End of quote. Shacochis slightly rewrites the Civil War in this story, suggesting that the North of America was not really in favor of the abolition of slavery, considering the social and racial situation in the big cities in the North of America. Remember the slaughter of Negroes in the United States, in New York especially. And the North of America, a country called the New World, but with old and very European, as I quoted in the beginning of my introduction, with very European prejudice. What then might Bob Shacochis mean by the next New World, the title of his second collection of stories? In one of those stories, called The Trap Door, his narrator states that the tropic sun ruins one's sense of proportion. Quote, "Men were not men in the Indies, but gods and animals." Unquote. On the last page of the book, in a very different story, I read, "The saints of the New World lived on in history, but their descendants, bastards of the bastards of the bastards, left in the night for America. Perhaps when they were somebodies, or the children of somebodies, they came home." Unquote. The next New World in Bob Shacochis' story seems to be a world yet to be made. Maybe it will be a tolerant, liberal society with harmoniously mixed cultures. I don't know. But not a paradise lost, maybe a paradise regained. And we might read about that in his novel To Come, Swimming in a Volcano. And now I will give the floor to Bob Shacochis himself. Thank you.
I can't imagine getting a better introduction than that. Maybe it will become the thing in an American writer's career to come to Amsterdam and be introduced. But it's great. I was given. Thank you for coming and placing your faith in the John Adams Institute. I know most of you have never heard of me before in your life, but that will change. He said modestly. I was given a choice to read or to give a lecture. I hope you won't disapprove that I chose to give a lecture about something, thoughts that I've been trying to articulate for a long time. It's not so much an academic treatise or analysis as it is a declaration of an emerging identity, my own identity as a writer, trying to understand what it is I'm up to. You know, I don't really know. I have to discover that each step of the way. So it's a declaration of identity, an emerging identity, and the context for that identity. Along the way, you might find out a little bit of information of why you don't know me. Because the American literary scene in America is quite a system, and I haven't been invisible in that system, but I haven't been riding the trends that would have splashed me ashore in Europe 4 or 5 years ago in a more timely fashion. But hopefully what I have to say makes sense. I can't promise. The literature of political experience. I'd like to talk about music, says the privileged girl turned guerrilla fighter. But in my heart, I'm afraid it would be frivolous. We encounter this pathetic woman in Chilean author José Donoso's recent novel, Curfew, a story about the bitter texture of life in Pinochet's Chile, 12 years after the coup that ended with the death of Salvador Allende. The woman drags her ex-lover through Santiago's deserted streets after the midnight curfew, searching for the army officer who a decade past, during a staged interrogation, had made her pretend to scream in pain, a pretense that ultimately devastated the inner architecture of this woman's personality, undermining her self-identity far more efficiently than the rapes inflicted upon her revolutionary sisters at the same time. Her surface survived unblemished, everything beneath it corroded and collapsed. In Chile, Mr. Donoso has said, all personal pain had to have at least a political subtext. Well, imagine most Americans saying this. Most Americans wouldn't say it because the American culture measures experience differently than many cultures in the world, either with a luxurious, apolitical glance toward events, or like the generals who commanded in South Vietnam in the 1960s, with an optimistic capacity for self-delusion. When I read the Donoso character's chilling remark about the frivolity of music, it reminded me of the first time back in 1981 that I had heard the poet Carolyn Forche, she's an American poet about my age, read from The Country Between Us, the book that evolved out of the events she had witnessed in El Salvador in 1977 and 78 and 79. I listened to her soul-sickening evocation of the Colonel's burlap sack of human ears, cut like bullring prizes from the corpses of Salvadoran citizens caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, as often as not the victim's own home in their own bed in the dark of the night. I listened to the images of bodies never found, of poetry set to ashes in the public square. And I listened also to the echo of criticism directed at Forche by her peers, who accused her of consciously and deliberately allowing her art to bear the contaminating vapors of her politics. I listened to the litany of carnage and suffering, and I could not will away the vertigo of dread that had descended upon me. I could not keep my throat from its involuntary constriction, alone and suddenly too much by myself in the shadowed corner of the auditorium. I could not prevent the surprising rhythm of threat that invaded my breathing, my emotions escalating toward a private panic, and perhaps most significantly, I could not prevent my sense of self-humiliation as Forche told the audience what all of us know, but it seems so few of us actually believe, as though this information were only the fascinating spice of the newspaper, the dust of history, the scare tactics of religion, or merely some Hollywood premise of profit. There is nothing one man will not do to another, said Forche. Certainly there are intelligent people who will say, I'm oversensitive when I confess that the burden of that truth, expressed with such simplicity, crushed me. Forche had identified the devil's trump card, the one factor that ensured a built-in shelf life to all human endeavor and advancement, all noble ideas and grand systems, all pretty philosophy and all righteous ideology, the mathematics of every human formula, starting with the two-ness of lovers to the fourness of families, to the squared equation of generations, and the algebra of nations than the calculus of empires. Beware, pleaded Forchet, beware, there is nothing one man will not do to another. Listening to Forchet, I felt I was as much in a corner spiritually as I was physically, and that I had no alternative but to condemn myself. Here is what I said. Before me stands a writer fully engaged with the seriousness of the world, a writer who has yoked herself to the macrocosmic realities of the human condition, and therefore an important writer in a way that I perhaps can never be, given my nature, given my fondness for absurdity and play, my weakness for cleverness and funny business, my taste for wisecracks, and my juvenile response to authority. I too have been exposed to the horrors of the world, have stepped around bodies in the street, have seen women rip hair from their heads in grief. And yet, here I was, at the end of a week spent grinding out a jazzy little short story about a drug dealer jogging in his underpants through Palm Beach, that New World capital of aristocratic decadence mimicking the European ruling class. The shame I felt did not feel inappropriate. My work, my precious darling, my music was frivolous. Sitting in the darkness of the lecture hall, chastised by the blood and tears and sorrow of Forchet's verse, I believed in my frivolity as deeply as I believed in my commitment to writing, whatever that overwhelming compulsion was, and I was miserable. The few but increasing successes of my stories seemed a mockery. Yes, I was making it, being published and gaining attention, and yes, my making it could not possibly have any meaning, any higher integrity or effect than that found in the most insubstantial careers and vocations. I might just as well be applying color to cartoons for the Saturday morning television shows. But slow down, I said to myself. Like most writers, I'm hard on myself. Like most insecure people, my initial reactions to issues of consequence are usually neurotic pirouettes of disproportion. Wait a minute, I said to myself as I trudged from the hall after we had given Forchet the emotional ovation she deserved. I was forgetting an underlying truth about the dynamic of political conflict, the visions that fueled it. What was the fighting about in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, in Chile, Peru, and Argentina, in Haiti, and in the Philippines, and in Iran, in Grenada, and Lebanon, and in South Africa, and throughout Africa, and scores of other venues around the globe? Wasn't it true that all too often, at the summit of opposing factions, the guardians of the status quo and the angels of revolution were battling in their own self-interest for personal access to the perilous glories and wealth of possibilities of power? Wasn't it true that far too often, first came the years of sacrifice in the name of the people, then came the victory feast at the same table where the old regime of vampires had gorged itself? Under a magnifying glass, change was sometimes apparent, but not as a rule. Wasn't it true that all grand plans to change the world, all attempts except perhaps art, were cruel? Meanwhile, what were the people fighting for, the yous and the me's, the ordinary lives on the street? For freedom, of course, always freedom, forever freedom. Freedom long familiar to affluent Americans, freedom refined daily into a general grumbling in our courts and legislative houses. Freedom to have a mouth, to use that mouth for eating and speaking. Freedom to possess eyes and ears, to use them without fear and without capricious interference. Freedom to follow one's nose into the kitchen of the state to see what's cooking. Freedom to own our hands, to use those hands to love the land, to offer milk to a child, to build a house or raise a flag or cast a paper ballot with enough force of justice to knock a monster out of a throne. And freedom most of all to have a mind, and having a mind, freedom to have an imagination infatuated with the world, and having an imagination, freedom to be lighthearted or serious, freedom to be entertaining or enlightening, freedom to be dedicated to higher cause or indulgent in lesser pleasure, to be this or that or frivolous, to be always and fully human while remembering that paradise, not earth, is the failed experiment. To be frivolous, then, could be interpreted as an indirect form of political expression, a symptom of a particular social reality, a statement of the highest significance. It said, I am free, if not necessarily responsible, but we are free people. Now I had constructed a framework to judge myself within, two atmospheric and inevitably thematic poles of creativity, frivolity and seriousness. Yet the needle of my moral compass swung somewhat ambivalently in both directions, and perhaps this confusion of loyalties is a universal dilemma, or perhaps as an American, it's only my own. For the sake of the dialectic, let me depersonalize the definition of frivolity and distance it from all troublesome reference to humor or entertainment, and contain it within the psychologically destroyed Chilean woman's rigid and unforgiving perception of music, that which has no political text or subtext is innately frivolous. By trapping frivolity within this context, the context paradoxically broadens and in fact becomes populated with the work of the majority of serious creative writers in contemporary America. Work that is decidedly inward, that is, away from the state and the wider social fabric, and politically indifferent or obtuse. At this point in the argument, there's little chance to sidestep the conclusion that frivolity's camp is the literature of domestic experience, the literature of the uninterrupted life, where only natural death, interior turmoil, or happenstance of undirected fate, a car wreck, for instance, invades the intimacy. I'm speaking of the fictional self untaxed by history or the making of history. Spinning at the opposite end of this globe of experience is the literature of political engagement. If in your own creative sensibilities you're an advocate of the literature of domestic experience, I'm curious as to how you would respond to the Polish writer Ryszard Kapuscinski. 20 years ago, Kapuscinski recently told an interviewer, I was in Africa and this is what I saw. I went from revolution to coup d'etat, from one war to another. I witnessed, in effect, history in the making, real history, contemporary history, our history. But I was also surprised. I never saw a writer. I never met a poet or philosopher, even a sociologist. Where were they? Such important events and not a single writer anywhere. Then I would return to Europe and I would find them. They would be at home, writing their little domestic stories. The boy, the girl, the laughing, the intimacy, the marriage, the divorce. In short, the same story we've been reading over and over again for 1,000 years. You know, the other day I was reading about the novels that won the annual French prizes. It was incredible. None of these books had anything to do with our world, our reality, nothing. There was one book about an unwanted child, and another about a boy, a girl, the laughing, the intimacy. That's the end of the quote. If we are to take Kapuscinski at face value, who would have imagined it? the French pretending to be as innocent as their counterparts across the Atlantic. Except our pattern of innocence had changed somewhat. Now we wrote about the boy, the girl, the laughing, the intimacy, the boredom, the meaninglessness. But truly, how are American writers to answer Kapuscinski? American writers, an invisible national assembly bombarded with criticism from our global colleagues for allegedly composing fiction in which every protagonist seems to be a stalwart, if angst-ridden, member of the middle class, lives in the suburbs, and sees a psychiatrist. American writers, a group accused of having a broken vision, no longer capable of evoking visceral passions. Who said these things? A Chinese novelist, a South African poet, an Israeli novelist. Their comments were typical of the point of view shared by many multinational writers who attended the International Pen Congress in New York a few years ago. And although it's clear to me these writers displayed only a superficial knowledge of the American scene, they nevertheless reflected an image which had been pervasive throughout the 1980s, perhaps for justifiable reasons. Anyway, I think we could begin to respond to Kapuscinski by referring to something the Michigan novelist and poet Jim Harrison once wrote. "There are no old myths," said Harrison, "only new people. If the story of the boy, the girl, the laughing, the intimacy has been told repeatedly for 1,000 years and more, then most certainly it is a story we want to hear and can't afford to lose. A story that reveals too much about ourselves to ignore. A story of purity and merit and fundamental vitality unfolding around the core of two lives to find there some proper mix of pathos and redemption. A story that we simply can't let drift out of our ethos without skewering the meaning of existence, at least on the stage of Western civilization, and I suspect also for all mankind. But there remains something unsatisfactory and incomplete about this answer, so the issue must be amplified. Isn't it true that the highest, perhaps the word should be divine, power of literature derives not from its ability to differentiate between a lie, and the truth, which is the business of journalism, of information, to separate lies from truth, and not from its focus upon the friction between illusion and reality, which creates a metaphysical hunting ground best left to the bravado of philosophers, but rather to the ear it offers the cosmic dissonance that rings through the millennium from the clash of profound truths, one slamming into another. For instance, consider this aphorism from Hemingway. If two people are truly in love, there's no way it can all end happily. This is rather more than a lie opposed by the truth, but the realization that the opposite of a profound truth might very well be another profound truth. Aha, we say, the crux of irony, a real impasse and no place to get lost. But what's the big deal? Surely this is indeed irony, but not the petty irony of lies and facts, not the trickster irony of reality muddled by illusion. It's the irony of essences, of love and death, and it is the furnace of meaning where all that we might understand about our aspirations through the wide open senses of literature and art is smelted down to its richest, most potent shapes. And ironically, the essences are as available in the supermarket as they are in the marketplace of ideas. The catch being that only the artist is likely to sniff them out down the sanitized aisles thronged with housewives and groceries. Access to irony favors the artist, not the journalist, not the philosopher, not the sociologist. And if gunmen happen to burst through the doors for the sake of expedience, so much the better, though don't be surprised if you notice many of the writers crawling on their bellies toward the back exit while the journalists are trying to crawl in. Gunmen, after all, are sensational, and a supermarket is an embarrassingly ignoble place to die. It now seems I've either answered Kapuscinski sufficiently or painted myself deeper into the corner. The continuum of myth, like the DNA of genetics, the universality of irony, a transcendent soul. Doesn't American literature, the best of our literature of domestic experience, shimmer with these qualities? Certainly. Add place and character and movement, and they constitute a living, breathing body of literature that can walk the world. But what makes the work of writers like Harrison and Hemingway so memorable, in my opinion, so quintessentially American, and yet not confined by the parameters of nationality, is the flesh they wrap around the structure of these elements, the raw material of an unlimited world, a tissue that pulses with the tension between the intimate and the global, fiber that registers, to borrow a phrase from the novelist Robert Stone, the random promiscuity of events on the surface of a sphere twisting in orderly but unfathomable fashion through space. There's been much said and written about the shortcomings of American fiction during the past 10 or 15 years. I won't disappoint you by denying there's been a problem beyond the Yankee Catechism, beyond the incorporation and bureaucratization of the house of literature, where trends imitate progress and sales trivialize achievement, where celebrityhood is the only measure of value. For me, the more telling source of the problem is to be found in our diet, what and how much we are comfortable eating from the wilder and less familiar gardens of experience. Something happened. It's no secret it was Vietnam. And we became afraid of those gardens, their groves of hollowed trees packed with the glucose-rich hives of human power. Some of us became afraid of eating altogether, but only snacked on cultural ephemera, and so became anorexic, listless, undernourished, withdrawn into the extravagance of our own destruction, auditing the nuances of ennui and guilt, with no strength and no stamina, and especially no desire to write in a bold and sweeping manner about our lives in our homeland and how our lives in our homeland interlocked into the bigger picture. I feel suddenly feeble just having said those words, bold and sweeping. They aren't the only road out of town, and I would hate it if they were. Still, as an American writer, I'm aware of a set of questions that are constantly on my mind which seem to resist resolution. Do American writers and readers have a fundamental problem with scope, with global and historical scale that attempts to be more than backgrounding and props? Should our literature embody the truth that we Americans have an enormous impact on hundreds of millions of lives beyond our borders? Are there more than a handful of novelists in our country who even know what the term Pax Americana means, or what its historical antecedents are? Or is the character of the creative mind by nature isolationist, releasing itself into the safety of known territory to enhance its pursuit of the unknown? And I ask myself, are these questions fair? And how are they relevant to art's mandate and what, after all, is the mandate of art. We are not pamphleteers. It is not our duty to inspire better policy, less so to shout out pieties. Our obligation is simple, to make better books. But how? And are we doing it? Ann Beattie's suburbs and urban salons are not Isabel Allende's Chile, mysterious land of earthquakes, assassinations, and clairvoyance, and hence cannot be nurtured by what we wrongly think of as the exotic, the other, which is a relative, not a fixed quality. However, as soon as we establish the relativity of exoticism, bells of recognition start chiming. The United States, mysterious land of earthquakes, assassinations, and clairvoyance. Earthquakes, California, Alaska. Assassinations, my adolescence. An adolescence that was a witness to a bloody stream of assassinations. Malcolm X, JFK, Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, who used to chaperone our youth council dances when I was a teenager. How could anyone have grown up in those years and not have the deaths of these men stamp their consciousness with a political postmark forever? And clairvoyance. Good God, they were over there reading tea leaves at the Reagan White House. Why do we shy away from the magic and the drama of our own world, our own environment? Perhaps it's all only a matter of not seeing the political forest through the domestic trees. Ray Carver's working-class neighborhoods of the Northwest are not Salman Rushdie's subcontinent, I don't suppose. John Updike's New England villages are not Nadine Gordimer's South Africa or Chinua Achebe's Nigeria. Ann Tyler's Tidewater, Maryland is not Carlos Fuentes' Mexico. Tama Janowitz's New York is not Milan Kundera's Prague or Solzhenitsyn's Gulag. Of course. But is there a meaning to be extracted from such unworkable comparisons? Maybe. Should American writers feel gypped because their milieu isn't more fucked up than it is? What a ridiculous thought. But there are times I flirt with the conclusion that American writers indulge themselves in a peculiar insularity that almost seems to be a negative response to our global involvement in the role of superpower, shrinking back not only from our extensive interests and the worst of our well-intentioned meddlings and muddlings throughout the third world, but shuddering with distaste for American hegemony, period. The fact is, they'd be happier if America was a small underdog of a nation, so they wouldn't have to look at their country as an idea set loose on the planet, an idea too monolithic and complex and aesthetically impenetrable to manage. Smoke on the horizon sends them indoors. With sighing relief, they retreat back to the landscape and private interiors where they feel most at ease. The shopping mall, the university, the farm, the trailer park, the small town, the neighborhood, the Upper West Side of New York, the nuclear family. In short, the places and settings that are experientially provincial. Certainly the scope inward has a challenge and reward in balance with the scope outward. Meanwhile, though, the news goes on, unchanging. America is still an empire, like it or not. But why aren't there more Conrads and Kiplings to chronicle its passage? More Orwells, more Mark Twains, more Somerset Maughams and E.M. Forsters? Is the full story of our nation being viewed through the lens and sifted through the filter of art? Political situations have always attracted me as a subject, writes the novelist Robert Stone. And not because I believe that political pathology is necessarily more important than private suffering. During times of political upheaval, the relationship between external reality and the individual's interior world is destabilized. Stone implies a bridge here between the two literatures, as I see it, arguing in support of the hyper-domesticity of the literature of political experience, the elements of drama descending on ordinary people and ordinary lives. Things happen ruthlessly, without mercy, we are reminded by Stone. The elemental force of things bears down upon us. From one moment to the next, we hardly know what's going on, let alone what it all means. Civilization and its attendant morality are not structures, they're more like notions, and sometimes they can seem very distant notions. They can be blown away in a second. Yet at the center of this ruthless, random fog of events bearing down on us, what is it we find when we ask our cameras to zoom in? At the center of the maelstrom, what's there is what we've known best all along: the boy, the girl, the laughing, the intimacy. Only the stakes have been rendered monumental. The laughing has a hysterical tone, and the intimacy has a desperation to it that fills us with horror. There never was a war that was not inward, wrote the poet Marianne Moore. I suppose the dominant inwardness of contemporary American fiction is one of the inevitable outcomes of successful democracy. When the extremes stabilize and recede, when the middle bulges with utopian complacency, and the culture can afford the posture, in the absence of threats large enough to provoke a unified response, it can afford the posture of canonizing the individual, each him and each her transformed into an icon of the apotheosis of freedom. In such a heady literary atmosphere, however, the value of the first-person point of view inflates. We notice less and less omniscience, and the present tense in fiction becomes a literary parallel to the national deficit. It says, "Be here now." It is made to be the tense of historical frivolity. Writers reject the macrocosm for the microcosm to exercise an imagination that never leaves home, or worse, never leaves self. In the worst case scenario, empathy atrophies from lack of will. Empathy atrophies from lack of, let's say, worldliness, while leaving sanctimony intact, consolidated by the residual arrogance we still find here at what David Halberstam calls the end of the American century. The self, untempered by a spectrum of experience, is mesmerized by self-gratification, self-despair, breeds a confused, dispiriting, moral dandyism of the sort we see spouting from Bret Easton Ellis in his defense of his forthcoming novel, American Psycho. Ellis complains that he grew up in and inherited a culture so violent, corrupt, and jading that he arrived at the gates of adulthood totally immune to shock. This not feeling is a bitter burlesque of feeling, a posturing, an artificiality that makes a parody of the human heart, a self-inflicted emotional inertia. Here's a writer who wants to have his existential cake and eat it too, but nowhere is life so one-dimensional as he would have it in his fiction. And I assure Mr. Ellis, if he got up off his powdered backside and took a stroll through the occupied West Bank, or drove his BMW for a drive from Basra to Kuwait City, or stopped in for lunch at a Somali refugee camp, or visited the Haitians in the Chrome Detention Center in Miami, he might find, finally, a small diamond of shock to take home and treasure. I'm sorely tempted to say that Mr. Ellis and the other members of his particular clubhouse risked nothing of value in their work. But to be honest, I don't really know if that's true. I can't say so with certainty, because the domestically oriented writer and the politically oriented writer measure worth differently, and their standards are not mutually exclusive and may in fact be symbiotic. What I do know is that the voice of American culture and the voice of American power has been trademarked by cynicism and naivete for the past 25 years, the extent almost of my own adult life. And what I've learned from experience is this: a nation's ultimate defense is not its military strength, but its cultural integrity. For all those who ask, what's the value of art? There it is. We might assume this basic tenet of nationhood is self-evident, but if it is not self-actualizing. Ask the people of Saigon if you harbor some doubts about this, or find a Vietnam vet who spent a year hunkered down at Da Nang. If the peace movement is still fighting the last war, so too perhaps is American literature, mired in the post-Vietnam era of withdrawal, a psychological truth but not a geopolitical reality. Perhaps it's time to reimagine ourselves as figures in transition, a gathering of opposites, virtue rising, and the blind force of aggression pulling man down. Better to fail at this than have our literature degenerate into the perverse aesthetic equivalent of insider trading. Anything to immunize culture not against shock, but against entropy. Must all causes, even survival, be offensive to the aesthete? I overstate my case. Our reevaluation of self has been understandably brutal in America since the Vietnam War. And what I've been describing is a national attitude that resulted from the wounds of a national trauma. In the self-effacing atmosphere that evolved, the literature of domestic experience ascended to the top of the literary mountain and reigned. What is needed now more than ever is a rehabilitation of the literature of political experience from the sub-basements of genre, a swarm with a cast of spies and agents, presidents and dictators, heroes and villains, as if this literature were the late-night television of superhuman intrigues and had nothing to do with real people. What I hope for are writers who bear witness to our failures without demeaning our dreams. Writers who testify to our arrogance, our blindness, our narcissism, without conveniently forgetting that as a people our story has been heroic, like it or not. Writers who are conduits for both the tragic and heroic in our destiny, a bright shining lie and a bright shining truth. What I am afraid of has already happened, that in the age of information, in the age of nuclear tourism, in the age of economic independence, in the age of high technology, in the age of the global village, it takes a war for Americans to finally figure out where the Persian Gulf is and what goes on there and how it can change their lives and cost them their lives. What I hope for is this, that more American writers will hold their work in their hand and tell it what the narrator of the novel Continental Drift tells his, which is, "Go, my book, and destroy the world as it is." Thank you.
We'll have a short break, about a quarter of an hour, and then we'll be back, like they say on CNN. Thank you.